Good morning, everybody.
Morning.
This is the most comfortable space I've ever been in, so Lester props, or Lester ran off to. You guys do this regularly, so I feel a little bit jealous. And I say that laughing because we'll probably get a little uncomfortable given what we're having to talk about today, right? The reality is talking about trafficking, I think, is never easy, but I think it's always good, especially when we are kind of confronting it from so many different intersections, or that we're working in this space, whether we realize it or not, if we care for or are somehow interacting with those who are experiencing vulnerabilities, right? We are then interacting with populations who have the possibility of being trafficked or having experienced some form of exploitation, right? So saying all this, I'm so glad to be here. I'm glad that we can kind of dive into this topic and then even think about what does it look like to respond, right? As a person of faith or as someone who cares about our community. And particularly knowing the resources and the networks that we have, what does that look like, right? How can we somehow help in the restoration of someone who has experienced exploitation and trafficking? As Hassan said, my name's Chris. I've been with Restore for 5 years. Restore is just one trafficking agency on a handful of agencies in New York, right? We're not trying to be the hero. We're not trying to be the end-all, be-all. We're specialists, and we have the privilege of working with a very specific population and to be able to provide very specific services because we have partners who can fill in those other gaps, right? So instead of being like, hey, we're coming to town and taking over the block, no, where are there gaps and how can we fill them? And then where are people crushing it? So let's support them in that effort, right? And learn together. We specialize in serving 4 national adult women. And we specialize in trafficking. Now our mission, it says sex trafficking specifically, and we're going to focus on that today. But we serve all women who have experienced any form of labor trafficking or sex trafficking, and we'll even dive into the nuances of that. So as we kind of start today, I just kind of want to push the question back out to you all. When you hear the term sex trafficking, you hear those words, my question is what thoughts, what images, or what words come up for you as you hear that?
Taken.
The movie. Did you already look at the slides? We'll probably talk about that. Yes, so Taken, right? Okay, Liam Neeson. What else?
Human slavery.
All right, so slavery of humans, yeah.
Bait and switch.
Bait and switch, that's good. Other things that come up are images, words. Yeah.
Promise.
Go ahead, go for it.
Promises of a better life.
Yeah, promise of a better life.
This alleyway in Flushing.
An alleyway in Flushing. Very specific. That's good.
41st.
Okay.
41st.
Yeah, you name it. It's okay. Right. Other things that come up. Betrayal. All right.
Omnipresent, because I feel like it's always happening now, but we just can't detect. It's like everywhere, but you don't really know it.
Yeah, it's good. So this idea of omnipresence, right? It's like everywhere, but then it's also somewhat hidden, invisible. Children. Okay. So we're talking about different characteristics of the problem. We're talking about people who may be affected. We're talking about specific locations, right? So we're not coming into the room like a blank slate. And there's probably things that we've heard or that we've read that have helped influence how we see trafficking. And there's also things, maybe like the movie Taken, that might distort what we actually see on the ground day to day, right? So I'm going to give you like a working baseline definition of trafficking, particularly sex trafficking. It's whenever someone's forced against their will into prostitution, all right? A little fancier definition is whenever someone is forced or coerced to have to provide sex for someone who's buying and someone who's making money off of that, all right? This is our kind of like street definition. If you walked out today and you ran into your friend and they say, hey, where were you? And you were telling, oh, I went to this seminar, this workshop about sex trafficking. This is the working definition, right? Someone being forced against their will into prostitution, okay? The key being that idea there is force, right? So a question I'll push back thinking about trafficking, often is that we want to isolate it to look like its own thing all by itself. But the reality is trafficking can often disguise itself as another form of crime. And the key thing to separate sex trafficking, for example, from sexual assault, rape, domestic violence, is this idea of the money, okay? Somebody is profiting, right, off the selling and buying of another person. Right? And the thing that's being provided is actually like a body, right? And sexual services. So that would be the separation between when you have an extreme force of someone experiencing sexual assault, rape, you name it. But when somebody else is profiting off of that somehow, that then crosses this threshold into sexual. Yeah, stop.
Besides just the bodily, could it also be images and video? Like, say somebody was forced into making a sex video. I'm thinking about the porn industry.
Yeah, good question. Yeah, so kind of the question I'll push back is like, where is there a threshold of crossing line with someone maybe having to be forced into some form of pornography, right? But then does it become trafficking? That gets a little nuanced, particularly if it comes to related. We're talking about children. What age? Is that video being shared outside of the country? So I can't actually answer that question because it gets very complicated, right? But there is more and more research coming into this reality, that space of those who may be exploited in pornography and its correlation or causation into trafficking, right? So that's kind of the what, right? Forcing someone into prostitution against their will. So the question then is, how does this happen, right? And you all kind of already named some of these things already. This idea of bait and switch, right? Or false promises. Right? For the women that we serve at Restore, again, specifically foreign nationals, let's think about those in the immigrant community. We always say this, it starts with a lie, right? That lie could be so simple. It doesn't have to be profound, it doesn't have to be complex, right? It could be a lie about just a friend. We call this befriending, where someone just, hey, I know you're in a tough situation, I can help you out, right? It could literally start there. It could be a lie about a false job. Hey, I know you're looking for work and you're having trouble finding it. I know someone in the city who can help you, right? It could be a lie, really when you think about it, we call it boyfriending, or this idea of wooing, where someone is playing a romantic interest, but in reality they're just using that ultimately to exert some form of power and control in the end, okay? It could be a lie like that. That doesn't even have to happen in person. So much of our relationships and interaction are facilitated through media that often a trafficking experience doesn't have to begin in person. It can literally be online. Another lie, again, could be in the form of a debt. This could start way back for someone who maybe is looking to come to the U.S. for opportunity. It could start with a lie around loans, and it becomes travel debt. That debt could ultimately be transferred to a handler, a trafficker. It could be debt that says, hey, I know this is short, but this will get you on your feet, right? But then what ends up happening, that debt accrues or it becomes to the point where it becomes impossible to pay back, okay? It could also be a lie about a safe place to stay, right? We talked about, again, this experiencing of homelessness, right? Over 2/3 of the women we serve have experienced homelessness, right? So when we think about vulnerabilities, when we think about the homeless population, right? Again, you see that overlap. Now we talk about a lie, and we talk about, hey, how does this start? There was a survey done by Polaris. They run the National Human Trafficking Hotline, and they've served tons of survivors. And in 2017, they released this report. They surveyed 10,000 survivors that they had contact with over the years. So 10,000 survivors, and they gave them a series of questions to learn more about their trafficking experience, the nature of it, right? And one of the questions was, what was their form of recruitment? What was that initial lie, right? The number one lie, whether it was an immigrant, someone who was born in the U.S., right, was the false promise of a job, okay? For some of us in the room, right, we might be first generation, second generation, third generation, right? And when we think about the dominant immigrant narrative, it's not all like the same, right? Some of us are pushed here, right? Some of us are pulled here. But the dominant immigrant narrative, if you're going to simplify it, is like, hey, I'm leaving here to come over here for opportunity. I'm leaving here for a lack of opportunity to come over here to find work, right? The propaganda of like the American machine of opportunity is amazing, all right, outside of the U.S. That opportunity is often connected to a job, right? So what may seem from the like outside, why would someone be duped or caught in that? But the reality is when someone is in that situation, I need to support a family, or I need to support children, or I just really want to make a better life for me, it's always going to be connected to a job, right? Traffickers know that. So if you're looking at where the intersection of where traffickers exploit, it often is at that intersection of a false job. So the question is, if that's how it starts, how do people get stuck in there, right? A lot of our partners in the domestic violence space are constantly pushing this message of like, why doesn't that person just leave, right? Get rid of that guy. And part of the messaging we have to correct is that this is complicated. It's not as simple as we think, right? In the same way, if someone gets tricked into a very bad exploited situation, literal sexual abuse, how come they don't leave? Well, insert into that situation threats against someone's physical safety, threats against their family. If someone's undocumented or overstayed a visa, threats to deport them, threats to report them to police. Throw into that situation physical violence, sexual violence. Throw into that situation fear. Throw into that situation isolation. Isolation could be geographic. Isolation could be when someone realizes the only people I know are connected to the people exploiting me, right? Isolation could be, you know what, my handle of the English language is limited, so to actually be able to communicate the realities I'm experiencing at my quote-unquote job, I don't even know if I could do that, right? Whether it's language, geographic, communal, isolation takes many forms. Throw into that, again, levers of fear, shame, and guilt, right? Some of us come from shame cultures, right? We don't even have to think about it, we just know it because we live it every day, right? Shame is like often the thing that keeps society going, okay? For many of the women we serve, shame is ultimately one of the most crippling factors for keeping them in a situation. Traffickers know this, okay? Often we think traffickers are just big, strong, bad guys, right? We need to give them more credit. They're actually brilliant at exploiting people, right? They're taking some of the things about our cultures and our backgrounds that are powerful and good and beautiful and making them poisoned to actually take advantage of people, right? So again, looking at that study of 10,000 survivors, what was the number one force or the number one coercive factor keeping someone in a trafficking situation? It was this fourth one, isolation. Isolation, isolation, isolation. We see this all the time. Trafficking too often happens in isolation, but restoration always has to happen in community. Okay? Always, right? So when I think about even city mission and building blocks, part of our work is about countering an exploitive community to creating a holistic, restorative community. Okay? So that's how often it starts and how women we serve get stuck in that situation. But zooming back out, right? If we talk about what, forcing someone into prostitution, the how, this idea of deception, false promises, right? The idea of shame and trauma. The question is like, who are we talking about, right? And often in a seminar like this or a workshop, we'll say this: trafficking affects everybody. Okay? It affects everybody. So there's no one face to trafficking. Now, although that statement I would definitely say is true, I would also say it's not accurate, and here's why. Right? If we talk about homelessness, youth, right? Throwaways, immigrants, okay? We talk about this, really what we're talking about is this idea of inequality, right? Vulnerabilities. And so if we're saying trafficking affects everybody so that we're not distorting who is being affected, we're misappropriating the actual reality of the problem, right? It's as if we were all born into an equal society. How many would love that if that were true, okay? Like, that's not true. You know, from a faith perspective, you know, we often say like, hey, something is not good or bad, it's neutral, but something may be neutral born into a broken world, a world that's bent on inequality. So when we think about who, we can't think that, well, the PhD from Columbia who lives on the Upper West Side, who's white and male and 50, has the same level of vulnerability as the person who is second-generation immigrant, single mother, et cetera, right? Like, we have to just press into that reality, okay? So thinking about who, there's always going to be at least three groups. There's the trafficker, a consumer, and a victim, whether we're talking about sex trafficking or labor trafficking. For the sake of today, when we think about victims, we want to make sure that we think about it from a perspective that isn't flat, right? How many are aware that there's like a conversation around, do we legalize or decriminalize prostitution, or do we not? Is anybody aware of that? Okay. And often in these conversations, not only are they so polarizing, right? We flatten the dialogue. And here's just using this as an example. We have to look at this problem from an individual perspective. There's literally an individual experiencing a crime, right? There's also an individual who has some certain level of choice, okay? But if that was the end of the conversation, then we're missing the broader picture. You have to understand, too, there's a market, right? Thinking about a market, you don't have to be a sociologist, you don't have to be a social worker or a counselor to know that a market standpoint, there's consumers, there's buyers, there's drivers, there's push-pull factors, right? So when in a market, there's someone driving this demand. In a market, there's someone profiting off of somebody else's labor, okay? But if we just look at it from a market but don't also understand the complexity of choice in front of them, again, we're oversimplifying the problem. To that point again, like I said earlier, we're not born into a society of equality, right? I say all these not to like give you a big answer, but actually to push you into the tension and complexity of what we're talking about, right? And I think for those who identify as people of faith or come from a church background, sometimes we want to oversimplify things, and it's actually not doing good. It's actually not helping our neighbor, right? We need to press into the complexity. And so we often think about trafficking in this sense. Somebody's individual freedom is being stripped away. It's literally being taken. Freedom of choice, freedom of safety, right? Freedom of autonomy, okay? But that freedom is being exploited in a market that is driven by the bottom line of profit. Whether you're selling homes, whether you're selling coffee, or whether you're selling bodies, the market is driven by this idea of profit. And this market, driven by profit, that is exploiting individuals, thrives in a society built on inequality. Okay? We have to look at it in this complex layer. All right, so even just pausing here, I've named some already. But when we think about this symbol of inequality, or another way of just thinking about vulnerabilities, what are the vulnerabilities or inequalities that we see in Queens, in our churches, in our neighborhoods, or that we've even experienced in our own lives? We can just name them out loud. Again, pushing into the discomfort.
Gender, age,
Gender.
class.
Craig, don't take them all. Don't steal them all, Craig. Does he do that? Just kidding. Okay, so age, right? Gender. It's only because I'm comfortable in this house that I did that. Okay. What else? What other inequalities or vulnerabilities do we see? Race, right? Our racial assignments. What else?
Economic opportunity.
Right? Economics, marginalization, where people may be pushed to the edges to accessing.
Educational resources.
Educational resources. I have a daughter who just started kindergarten, and my wife's like her biggest stress is around school, right? New York City isn't the best for that. But what other things do we experience, do we see? Think about vulnerabilities.
Language and accents.
Language, right? People's handle on the language, people's bias towards how people speak the language, how it might sound, therefore what we attach to that, right? Other things?
Their citizenship or like their national identity, like the rights that they give it.
Yeah, citizenship, right? Documentation. All right, so you guys get this, right? Okay. The reason I do this is just, again, to push us into the complexities. If we try and flatten the problem to say it affects everybody equally, or if we flatten the problem to like, oh, it's just this person's choice, right? We're drastically misunderstanding the complexities of how this problem works in society, in a market, and the reality of complex individuals, all right? And we're definitely ignoring history. So we looked at that idea of who, right? Pushing into this reality of vulnerabilities. One of the best quotes that I've heard is that people, or traffickers don't exploit people, they exploit vulnerabilities, okay? We looked at that. We looked at kind of the idea of who this affects and how it happens and how we define it. The question then is like where, right? So zooming out a little bit, even outside of Queens, the thing is, like I said, trafficking happens everywhere. Legally, like if you go any country in the world, on the books, this like form of modern slavery or trafficking is illegal. But the reality is it's present everywhere. So you have this reality of both it's local, hyper-local, and hyper-global, no matter where you go. The best estimates, this came back out in 2018, is that there are 40 million people who are experiencing what is quoted as modern slavery, right? This idea of forced labor, forced sexual exploitation, forced marriage, or child sexual exploitation, right? 40 million. Unless you have 40 mil in your bank account, that's like a hard number to grasp when we think about people, right? $150 billion industry. Sum this up, it's affecting a lot of people, and it's making traffickers a ton of money, all right? What we want to be able to talk about, though, is that when you look at that 40 million people, 71% are female, okay? So when we think about this idea of forced labor or trafficking, it's disproportionate to women, 71%. But if you zoom in and look at sex trafficking specifically, this is the number, 98%. So yes, we need to talk about sex trafficking and how it affects vulnerable communities, folks who maybe identify in the LGBTQ community, right? Young boys, we have to talk about it. But if we don't look at just the data, we're distorting the problem of, again, who is this? This is, again, a gendered problem. If we don't look at it through the gendered lens, again, we're distorting reality. 98% are women, 1 in 4 being under 18, okay? You're looking at that number, that's, again, fascinating. If we zoom in nationally, best estimates, again, just estimates, over 400,000 across the country. Every state has a reported trafficking case since 2012, right? So there's not a single state that this hasn't touched. The top 5 states are California, Florida, Texas, New York, and Ohio. That's like not a list you want to be on, right? Top 5 states for where trafficking is happening. So then the question is, like, what does it actually look like here when we think about this idea of where? Because when we talk about take-in or maybe other things we've seen, what trafficking looks like in northern India is going to look different than what it looks like in Western Congo. It's going to look different than what it looks like in San Antonio, Texas. It's going to look different than what it looks like here in New York, right? So what are the things that really manifest trafficking here? Well, the first is what we categorize as illicit massage, okay? Illicit massage business, this is not your massage envy kind of spa. These are these places that often act as a storefront for massage parlors or body work, but then really the premise is just set up to provide some form of sex services for paying customers, right? In New York, the estimates for this is for every Starbucks, right? There's one that I passed getting off the train. For every one Starbucks, there's about 4 illicit massage businesses. Okay, so when we think about prevalence, that's just in the 5 boroughs, right? That's illicit massage. Second, residential brothels, particularly in Queens, we see residential brothels, and this is where you see, again, time and again, for women who we've worked with in residential brothels, having to serve the highest volume of quote-unquote customers, okay? A third is hotels, where, again, the quote-unquote sex act or that transaction happens in a hotel. Often, this is very mobile, so someone is actually being transported by a car from place to place, then often has to meet someone at a hotel. And the fourth highest industry, as we call it, or market expression of sex trafficking, is escort services. And this is what gets kind of categorized as your Hollywood perspective of what, glorious, glamorous prostitution looks like. So whether it's escort services, things that happen in a hotel, or just a residential brothel that looks like any place you pass by on the street, or an illicit massage parlor, these are the highest forms of trafficking here in New York specifically. All right, we see this data at Restore. We also see it at a national level, looking at the hotline. Okay. Any questions on these so far?
Did you say residential brothel is most prevalent in Queens and New York?
Yes. So this is for just even for Restore, 1 in 4 clients are trafficked in a residential brothel. Okay.
In Queens.
Yeah, Queens is the hotbed. Queens is the epicenter. So like New York is known in the country. So most of my work I actually do is outside of New York because people come through New York and then are trafficked elsewhere. Again, if you're looking for bodies, you go where the bodies are. They're in New York. And so people are recruited from New York and then it goes elsewhere. So a lot of my work is consulting with out-of-state cases. Like Queens is the epicenter. People don't even refer to New York City, they just refer to Queens. Just want you to know of it across the country.
Is it true? I heard that the reason why is because the 2 airports are here, as well as all the connecting highways north and south.
Yeah, so you have like the corridor, the national corridor. You have the airplanes. Sorry, the airports.
Yeah.
So because again, movement, right? Transportation, recruitment is a critical factor. That's one of the driving forces here. But it's not just related to that, right? Like obviously New York, it's a metropolis. Over half, I forget the stat, but like well over half of New York City residents are immigrant communities, right? Or from what you count as a minority, right? So various levels of why this is happening in New York.
Is there a breakdown on the demographic of the victims?
Yes, and it's usually racially assigned, but not like ethnically or like nationally assigned. So if there's that report in 2017 is like the best data for us, just even giving you. So 1 in 5 of our clients are exploited in illicit massage, and that's primarily Chinese and informally mostly Korean. Residential brothels, most of our Spanish-speaking clients are exploited in residential brothels. Hotels affects everybody. This is the most fluid when it comes to population and area. Escort services is primarily the Eastern European bloc. Again, yeah.
I know that nail salons also have trafficking. I don't know if it's sex trafficking. Are you familiar with that at all?
Yeah, so the big thing is that New York Times put out a really good investigative report into nail salons.
Right.
I think it was in 2017. And so that was both amazing, but also just, again, thinking about how we get information, it sort of distorted, again, how big is the problem, right? Very real, very high labor trafficking. And a lot of these things, think about as gateways. So massage parlors, this is often a gateway to other places, right? Massage parlors often start here. Someone might have not actually experienced trafficking, but then they're trafficked, again, eventually in a brothel or a hotel. It's very fluid of where that happens. All right, we'll move on for a little bit, and then we'll stop towards the end for more questions, okay? Just breezing through some common misconceptions. We said Taken, right? Taken is like the catch, like the movie we often reference, and I have no shade against Liam Neeson, right? If I was like an older dude and then got asked to be an action star, I'd probably say yes to that, okay? But often it distorts what happens, okay? If you take Taken, for example, you have like the dominant narrative of hero, victim, villain, right? Who's the hero? He's a guy. Of course, he's got to be a guy. He's older. He's male, right? He's white. Who's the victim? Oh, she's clearly innocent. She's younger. She could have been like in a sorority or a model. She has that face, right? And then who's the villain? At least for Taken 1, we don't even know where he's from. He just has like an accent, right? So he's from over there. He's not one of our people. And it's just like this story is filled with drama and violence, drugs, like all the things, drugs, guns, violence, all of it, right? And we just unplug, right? We watch this to kind of escape, right? But if this is where we're getting our education, definitely not a good way. Because when you think about the Hollywood narrative, right, this wants to, it's very black and white. It's nothing is subtle, okay? When we think about trafficking, when we think about the exploitation of people, particularly in a sexually violent way, so often the tactics of how trafficking happens is much more subtle, right? It's a friend of a friend. It's a cousin. It starts okay, a little bit awkward, then maybe a little bit questionable, and before you know it, someone's experiencing sex trafficking, right? It's not this often quick switch, right? We're not pulling people off the street, throwing them in a van, drugging them, right? This probably affects like maybe 1% of our clients have this story. Much more often, it's much more subtle, it's much more complicated, and often the bad guy is not the big bad other, it's often someone that we know or is connected to our community, okay? Running through some of these, this is not what we see. Often the misconception is that it's over there. It's very much here, in New York City specifically. Another misconception is that women in prostitution are there by choice, right? To simplify this, often when we think about prostitution, we need to reframe this is often, as survivors say, the choiceless choice, right? It's a bigger question, not just about the individual, but a society that is not giving people options, right? That only immigrants are trafficked. Are immigrants experiencing vulnerabilities that lend them towards being exploited? Absolutely. But nothing about the definition of trafficking in its federal form, right, that's on the books, says you have to cross a border, right? You could be born and raised in Elmhurst, right, and someone could be tricking you or you having to be forced to provide sex for someone. You never leave that borough, right? You could be a survivor of trafficking. And again, similar to that, smuggling might be a part of someone's experience of trafficking, but it's not, again, part of the definition, okay? Another one is young girls. Now, again, our brothers and sisters who are younger in their adolescence, at a vulnerable position, potentially, yes, right? Another reason this gets distorted is that from a prosecution standpoint, if you're trying to prove trafficking for someone under 18, you actually don't have to prove force or coercion, okay? And what that means is if you're a prosecutor and you have way too many cases, right? And one's very complicated, and then one's for a kid who's 14 who was pimped out in Harlem, right? Still a very difficult case. But if you don't have to prove force or coercion in a court of law, you're going to take that case every time. So that's the stories that get into the media of who gets prosecuted or who gets sentenced, and the victim constantly looks like a young girl. So is this a victim population? Absolutely. But the average age for the women we serve is 41. Okay, so think about that. Who is that dominant narrative? Who is that ideal victim? A 41-year-old, and our average out of the women we serve who are survivors, 69% are mothers. So think. Average age 41 with a kid, survivor of trafficking, okay? Not 17-year-old college student who got picked up. The idea of misconception, if anybody's in this space around power and control, we understand that you can influence and exert power and control over somebody without laying a finger on them. If someone is experiencing the reality of being undocumented, if someone has debt, right, all of these things you can keep and threaten and intimidate someone without laying a finger on them. Therefore, they might look like they have relative freedom. So many women we work with can come and go from their workplace because so many other threats are over their lives that if they don't go, right, they're going to be seeing the consequences. So you don't have to be constantly held captive, chained in a basement to be a survivor. Again, exploitation by others is the final misconception we wanted to talk about that. Often it's someone we know. And think about it even just from our own communities. Often we connect and bond with folks who look like us, speak our language, shop at the same bodega, eat the same ramen, right? We extend that trust to our tribe. And that's not a bad thing. This is just a very like normal human nature. Traffickers know that, okay? They're going to exploit that, right? So this is kind of the wrapping up of the time. For Restore, there's some stuff you guys can take, but for us, we're a faith-based organization, right? We kind of view this from the sense that when God set things up, when he kind of created our world, he designed it for good, right? He designed it for us to be in right relationship, right? This idea of peaceful relationships or shalom, right? Right relationship with ourselves, with God, with each other, and with our communities, right? Other ways theologians talk about this is this idea of like we were created for human flourishing, all right? When we work in this space, we see human trafficking as the antithesis of God's intention for human flourishing, right? So thinking about that, so much of our work is restoring that narrative that God designed for us in the first place, okay? We see that from a faith perspective. And ultimately, it gives us hope because when we do this work, it's not on our intelligence, the excellence of our services. We see it from a faith perspective that God is doing this work of justice and restoration. We're participating in that, okay? What are the three main programs? Well, counseling and case management, housing and economic empowerment. Really, counseling is that intervention of if someone is experiencing that form of psychological coercion, force, experiencing massive amounts of compound trauma, not just from trafficking, but from maybe displacement, from migration, being isolated. We want to be able to house that service. All these services are done in a woman's first language, right? So we're not using a translator. So a lot of our staff look like the women that we work with, okay? Can speak their first language, are from their same communities or from their same hometowns. Our housing program, thinking about it from the sense of if you're experiencing homelessness, right? Think about even for us here, right? If we all of a sudden didn't have an apartment or didn't have a house, think about the instability that we'd experience. Now throw on top of that someone who maybe experienced sexual trauma. Throw on top of that compound debt. Throw on top of that being undocumented, right? Not having access to maybe a bank account, not having access to be able to put money down on an apartment. Think about all those layers, right? So housing is a critical intervention, whether it's emergency housing, like a quick stay, whether it's a transitional safe home, it's actually not far from where we are here, or it's independent living. Some survivors, right? Like we say this often, we serve incredible women who just happen to experience incredible harm, right? They don't need a safe home. They just need support. They just need help getting stable in their house. So we provide what we call flexible funding to stabilize them so that they can keep in their stay in their housing, or for this other one, stay in their job, right? So someone doesn't need to be over-programmatized. We want to lower those barriers, right? So housing could just be supporting someone in independent living. And the last is around economic empowerment. I talked about this before. So much of the first thing that was the lie was a false promise of a job. And so from a faith perspective, we want to reclaim that space, right? So the job isn't a space of exploitation, but a space of empowerment, right? And so lastly to this point around economic empowerment, when women have a job and they retain it for a year, their increase of income on average goes up to about, it's like a $27,000 raise, right, from wherever any other job they've ever had before. So if somebody wanted to throw you a $27,000 bonus right now, that's what the women experience when they get placed in a job with Restore. So our economic empowerment program is both kind of like the life job skills to thrive on a job and actually maintain a job. But you can do all of that, but if you don't actually connect people to an opportunity, this really goes nowhere, right? So our economic empowerment, we incubated the first workers' cooperative staffing agency. The workers' cooperative has been a model that has served a lot of victim populations, but particularly those who maybe are experiencing lacking documentation or in a process, right, to citizenship. The workers' cooperative also gives people choice, right? So from a trauma standpoint, we're empowering women to actually, they're running the business, okay? Workers' co-ops are often used when you think about, oh, we're going to start a bakery. So go to this bakery and buy those muffins because we're supporting a vulnerable population. Last time I checked, so that's a great model. But we live in New York City, okay? Right now, I just checked this number yesterday, we have 167 active clients. 167, okay? We get about 450 referrals a year. So 167 women can't all work at that bakery. So that's why the Workers Cooperative is a staffing agency. So the job is on our team and our partners to build up business partners. So we have partners who run 10 bakeries, coffee shops, catering, restaurants, working at a law firm, right? So we partner with all these businesses who want to have social impact, and we do it through the veil of a Workers Cooperative, serving the immigrant population. We do that specifically from a nuanced standpoint of, although there's power from a consumer to want to support something good, right? We want to be able to break the chain for someone feeling like they're getting a handout because they were a victim of a crime, right? So everyone who partners with our workers cooperative are doing it from the social justice standpoint of knowing that immigrant women are often at a disadvantage. So the workers cooperative is focused around serving that population and connecting them to a job and actually paying a premium. So people are hiring former survivors and paying way above minimum wage because they say, not only do we care about this, we actually want to pay them more, right? And so that's how we've incubated this to where we're connecting people to jobs, not just training them to actually thrive on the job. So whether it's jobs, housing, or any form of case management advocacy services, this is kind of the ways that we work with survivors here in New York City and partner with folks in the community. But I've talked way too much, so I'm going to wrap up and let you guys ask me a ton of questions and however much time we have left. Thanks, y'all. So yeah, what questions or thoughts do you guys have?
Yeah. This is just a more personal question.
Yeah.
How did you get involved in the work?
For me, when anti-trafficking first kind of came up, kind of like early 2000s, I'm just being totally honest. The face of the problem was Southeast Asian, right, or South Asian. It was Thailand. It was the Philippines, right. My mother, so I'm Swiss Filipino. That's why you're probably confused when you look at me. That's Los Angeles for you. So like when I saw the face of the victim, I was like, oh, that's my cousin Michelle. I was like, this is my people, right? And I'm just being honest, like that's not me saying I can't care about a problem that doesn't affect me, but it hit me in a different way. And so for about 15 years, I just gave all my disposable income to anti-trafficking work, and eventually a door opened for me to come into the space. So I approach it more, again, there's so many intersections. For me, I went to seminary and graduated in 2014, because for me it was like, this is something that I really care about, and I was trusting that God would eventually open up a door and versus me forcing it. And Restore is a faith-based organization, and at the time, they had grown to the point where they needed someone in my particular experience and skill set. So that's kind of like my genesis of getting into this work. Does that answer that question?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was gonna say, like, how often are people who become subject to trafficking through, like, like services to help them with citizenship or things like that? Are those or any place like that for fronts?
That's a good question. We see it on the front end, not so much on the back end. So we see it more on the visa fraud, other travel agencies who are part of the network. Again, it could depend on where people are coming from. But let me give a recent example. Law enforcement thinks that, we just need to constantly go back to the source country. Who is actually trying to connect people to that travel agent? Who is connecting people to how to hack the system to get that visa? Looking at the itinerary, most women that we work with from Asia are coming through Europe or Canada. Right? They're not coming directly here, right? And so the thing that's been broken, though, is that people can get here. So traffickers have learned they're at more risk if they're reaching that far to have touch and contact with victims from A to Z. So what they do is just like, where is there overpopulated communities without access to jobs, right? And so I think it was really during Obama's presidency, the floodgates were opened with China and visas. So what ended up happening, there was an overwhelming number of people coming, but then ultimately not having access to jobs. So the victim population from Asia, particularly East Asia, has skyrocketed. Okay, it's not saying they weren't being exploited before. So but that doesn't have to do with because somebody's going back, right? It actually has to recognize where there are vulnerabilities here. But as far as that citizenship process on the late end, often that's more of a helping side of actually giving people protection, immigration status, so that they have access like a regular citizen. Yeah.
How is the working relationship between like your organization, your networks of organizations, and law enforcement? Has that been evolving and improving over time? Or?
It really depends on who you ask. So like, again, it gets complicated, right? For us, like we, again, from a faith perspective, it usually influences a lot that we do and shapes it, but it's not then communicated. But we view this space as, if we're not doing any collaboration, we're not actually addressing the problem. Think about it. Trafficking is a travel thing. It's a business thing. It's a banking thing. It's a storefront thing. There's so many layers to it, right? If we're just thinking law enforcement is going to be the hero, or that we're going to be the hero, we're drastically misunderstanding the problem. Right? We need a more sophisticated response. So with that, we think about, just as God desires us to thrive in community, we need the solutions to be collaborative in community. Just as we don't look at ourselves as the savior, but we say, no, Jesus is the savior, we're not going to try and go into the space and solve everything. We're going to work with our partners even when they screw up. Right? Even when law enforcement does something that law enforcement does, and we're like, seriously, you're just making it harder. Right? We're going to work with them because think about it, like even for the U.S., that's often referred, like think about if Dr. King in the middle of the civil rights movement was like, you know what, this sucks, I'm moving to wherever, right? Like England's a little further along, I'm going to jump ship and go over there. Just think about that, right? Like if we just jumped out of the problem because people around us were screwing it up, right? And it's also the perspective that they're the problem, not us. Like part of the reason that we enjoy this space is that we look at it as we're learners. We're constantly going to be failing and succeeded, but if we're not learning from that, then we're not actually being accountable to the women we serve. So we work with law enforcement in a way that is constantly centered on the survivor, but we also know that without law enforcement, often the systemic problem doesn't shift. Do you ask another service provider, they're going to give you a different answer.
I guess like in addition to like responding, I guess, to victims of trafficking, like so you doing like prevention work, I guess, like shutting down trafficking systems or
Yeah.
looking out for
So we do a lot of preventive. So of the typical, so if we kind of break into spectrums, we're like prevention, discovery, recovery, beyond recovery. It's one of these like social work, right? Prevention, discovery, recovery. We would say we're like discovery, recovery, beyond recovery. A lot of because so many folks do prevention work from a resource standpoint, we're like, you know what? We don't also need to do it, right? From a disruption standpoint, we do that a lot collaboratively. So because we have so much intelligence, not like we're smart, but intelligence from survivors, like, hey, this is what happened to me, without breaking like some form of confidentiality, we can take patterns of how people are doing things to work with stakeholders who are doing disruption or who are trying to build cases. So we have a conference coming in 2 weeks that I'm helping lead in DC, and it's all around that space. So is Restore doing it? No. Like, you're not going to go to our website and see it, but because of what we've learned, again, in survivors using their voice, we're using that to shape what other people are doing. And that's where we see some of our greatest prevention work.
There was a question from the registration.
Yeah.
And this was the question: what do victims of human trafficking need the most?
That's a great question. That's the question, right? What do victims need the most? It depends on who the victim is, right? We say this a lot, that every woman that we serve, again, we specialize in serving immigrant women, is going to have a different need, right? Even if there might be patterns, okay? Like we have services because they're directed by those needs. In the end, it's going to be client-specific. So the greatest things that we've seen have kind of shaped what we do. So Restore started because there was a social worker working with those in homelessness and those who were experiencing domestic violence, and she kept seeing more women who were not domestic, they were foreign nationals, okay, who, what they were experiencing wasn't just homelessness, there was some form of exploitive nature at their quote-unquote job, and that job somehow involved some form of sexual activity. So it wasn't just homelessness, and I don't mean that as simplifying the problem, like it was homelessness and. It wasn't just domestic violence, it was domestic violence and, right? But there was no space, there was zero housing that was specialized for trafficking survivors in the entire Northeast, and there was no one specialized with the culturally appropriate services, right? Whether it was folks from Dominican Republic, from Brazil, from Eastern Europe, or from China, like no one was working with that population, and this is a very specific problem of compound trauma from sexual violence. So housing that need is what House Restore started. And then it eventually became jobs, jobs, jobs. And that's how we developed and iterated our economic empowerment. So when we think about it from like a dramatic standpoint, often when law enforcement does a case, they're coming into contact with victims, and so we become like victim specialists to build that bridge, okay? In a moment of crisis where someone is losing where they're living, a moment of crisis where someone is clearly experiencing incredible amounts of sexual violence and trauma, right? They don't have any of their clothes. The basic needs may seem to be there. Oh, they probably need food. Probably need some clothes because they only have the pants that they're wearing, right? Food, clothing, right? Housing, you might think those are basic needs. Yes, so many of the women we work with, the first thing they'll say is, I need a job, right? They might need to go to the hospital because they have like bruises. No, the first thing at the forefront of their brain is, I need a job. And we need to stop saying, no, you need clothes. Like, yes, you probably need clothes, but every time we do that, we're minimizing and swallowing their voice, right? And so that eventually said we need to create a job program, and that's ultimately why we created the co-op. So housing and jobs are really directed by the population that we work with. Other needs can be from immigration services, legal services, you name it. Someone can be just connected to community that is from their same ethnic group, but not connected to the group that's from a specific neighborhood, right? So the needs will change, but the big needs really are reflected in our services from jobs, housing, and mental health services.
Chris, how do employers then partner with you guys so that we can provide more jobs?
Yeah, so this is one of our biggest asks. So if anybody has a business or is a manager who has access to people who can, we connect with our manager of job development. We basically go through a process of partnership where someone says, hey, this is what we do, this is what we have, and this is what we're curious about if there's something that we can overlap here. And we kind of say, hey, this is the general population we serve, these are their strengths, but these are also the challenges, and this is what we kind of ask. Again, if they're working with a cooperative, we would want to pay a premium on their work. We understand you can't pay someone a CEO salary who's doing dishes, right, or who's making your espresso, but we still would say, hey, we would want to align on that greater kind of good. It's actually pretty simple. After that, there might be some levels of training, but a lot of it has to do with, again, thinking from a survivor's perspective. They just don't want a job, they don't want pity, right? So we want to make sure that we're protecting survivors, but also protecting the businesses who are hiring. So we have a process through our supportive services, so that's the other side, of where people are saying what are their dream jobs, what is the field they want to go into, what are their current skill sets, right? So that we're placing people in where they want to be or where they can see themselves eventually going. We don't want to just say, hey, someone needs a job, and then, oh, you run a catering business, okay, work there, right? But if that's actually not going to serve the business, and that's actually not where they want to go, that's not going to be a good relationship. So working with survivors, they kind of can direct where they want to go, what their skills are. Working with the business partners, we're saying what are the things required for this space, and we're constantly doing a matching program. That's kind of how it starts, and then once people get placed, we go from there.
And what can we do? Like once we hear this, I'm like, well, what do we do now? Like, is there anything that we can physically do with you guys, or are there?
Yeah, I'll give you a few things. So on the job front, again, it just often is just making a connection. Not everybody runs a business or has their own business. If you do, props. But if you don't, like if you know folks who run businesses who are managers, like building a bridge into the job market. Okay, we say that we're rapidly attached to the job market for the sake of survivors. So those initial connections. If you do run a business, you don't have to have 50 employees. You could have 3, right? Or you could have an office that says, hey, we need the cleaning services. We have a break off of the workers cooperative that's just around cleaning because survivors said, hey, we want to do this. So they're kind of like starting a branch of it, right? Just figuring out ways where there could be opportunities, whether it's full-time, part-time, or one-offs. So building that job network is key. So that's kind of like that first thing. The second thing is around housing. So much of the work we do isn't just in a safe home, it's actually just connecting people to apartments, okay? So if you're a landlord or you own a property, amazing, right? But if you're not, you just know that you live in a building, maybe it's middle income, or maybe it's income specific, or maybe you just know the super, and you feel like you have an in, that when something opens up, you guys could have an apartment that we could know about, right? If you've had to move in New York City, right, it's like a nightmare, okay? Think about that again for survivors also trying to like stabilize their life in other ways, okay? So from a housing standpoint, whether it's, again, a connection, or whether you have a particular position of influence around housing, or you just know people, right, starting there. The third way is around volunteering. Through all of our programs, so much of it is extended because of volunteers. So you could volunteer in our Safe Home, you can volunteer as a mentor or as a supporter through our Economic Empowerment Program. We do that from an entrepreneurship standpoint. We also do it from just the supportive services standpoint. So if you want to be a mentor, you can do that through the volunteer. If you want to work in our Safe Home, we have regular volunteers in our Safe Home. It's the highest volume of where we have volunteers connect. You have to be female, though, to do that. If you speak another language, okay, Korean, Mandarin, Cantonese, name the language, Spanish, you could be support for our like crisis response. So if someone's in emergency, you would go out with one of our social workers and be a support. If you don't have a lot of time, but you're great at translation, you could be a translator. If somebody just wants to accompany someone and we don't have the staff capacity and they just need to go to their appointment at the doctor, you could accompany them, right? So if you have any language capacity besides English, you're like a game changer because your ability to work with the clients. So those are kind of our big thing. And then obviously there's financial giving, whether that's monthly, one time, or coming to our events. Those are great ways to connect, right? So whether it's finances, whether it's volunteering, or plugging in or connecting through our housing program, or plugging in and connecting to our economic empowerment program, these are different ways that are the easiest ways and on-ramps for you to help. Yeah, and if you guys are at any churches too, this is where like a lot of this stuff starts in small conversations, and then someone within a church, whether it's a leader or just someone who's involved in the community that says, hey, I want to be talking about this. And again, it's a connection to a pastor or connected to a leader. So just another way of broadening who knows about this.
What would you say, like, approaching sex trafficking, like human trafficking in general, from a faith-based perspective, like, from faith-based work, like, what would you say, I'm trying to articulate as well, but like,
Sure.
what does it like bring to the table? Like, what did you find especially like beneficial from working from this standpoint as opposed to like a more like
Yeah, that's a good. Yeah. So kind of how's faith? Let me answer the. Let me try and answer the question. And I was talking about this a little bit earlier. We experience more darkness than we do light every day at the office. Like, this is being real. Like, we see the ugliness of humanity every day. That we actually do this to each other, right? If there wasn't the hope of the gospel, I have no idea how anybody would survive in this work. Okay, so many of our partners that we work in the city are not faith-based, but it was so ironic that so many of the partners that we work with are Christian or attend church regularly, but they're working for like a non-profit that isn't faith-based, right? But I think for us at Restore, we have hope, and ultimately this story, no matter how ugly it is here, ends in victory. Right? Not to get all preachy, but for us, like, we can't go to work and serve clients every day, seeing all the problems that we face, seeing the systemic injustice, seeing the amount of trauma people have experienced. Like, we can't stare at that without the hope of the gospel, because all the evidence says this world is broken and it's never going to get fixed. Right? So having that faith perspective allows us to have hope in the midst of incredible despair. Right? Having like the hope of the gospel gives us encouragement in the midst of saying, I just want to give up. Right? So for us, that's where I feel like that resource is ultimately the game changer. The other thing too is for us, like from a faith perspective, is that, and I said this before, that we can't do this alone. Right? We're not trying to be the quote unquote Messiah. Like, we're not saving people. Right? We're not rescuing people. We're literally working with incredible women who have had incredibly harm done to them. How can we counter that narrative through services and through relationship and closing that gap? Right? Does that answer the question?
Yeah.
Maybe you said it, but I didn't hear it. How do you make contact with these?
Yeah, great question.
Like,
Yeah.
you said referrals. You get like
Yes.
400 referrals, and I'm like,
Yes. So 400. Yes, we on average we get about 450 referrals a year, and so our referrals come from a vast array of partners. So it could be from law enforcement, from like local PD, FBI, DHS, all the way up, to that federal level. It could be from another service provider. So maybe it's an attorney working in family law, and through working on this case, you're like, hey, there's something else going on here. So a lot of our referrals come from attorneys, right? It could be from immigration attorneys if someone's looking for about status, but it's like, oh wait, they've actually experienced a crime, right? So whether it's law enforcement, our attorney partners, the others are other service providers. So someone could be like a community group that's very local. It's like, hey, we work with Filipino women in Brooklyn. And it's like, oh, through that community, they realize someone's experienced a crime. So, how can we be connected more locally on the ground? For us, it's like, we don't want to build the castle and say, hey, look, our castle's pretty, come to the castle. No, we kind of say, like, we need to go fishing. We need to go and actually connect with folks on the ground. So we're in communities a lot through our partners, right? So whether it's a community-based organization, attorneys, law enforcement, and then survivors. Our best promoters are those who've experienced the success of our work, right? So again, I would say, so survivors have now made up through referral about 18% of our clients, okay? And that's not even a hard sell. Like, we're not saying, hey, go tell us about your friends.
I just know there's several ministries in Flushing that are out on the street. They're creating relationships with the they know where the brothels are. They know
Yeah.
the massage parlors, and so they're making a concerted effort to try to build relationships with
Yeah.
the women in these situations, trying to give them hope
Sure.
to take that step to get out. And I was
Yeah.
just because I know those ministries, I know the people
Yeah.
that are doing them. That's how I was curious.
Yeah.
Regarding yours, that's all.
Yeah, so those, I mean, and there's also the court system, like, again, through the courts. So, like just giving you guys an example of how this should, 2015, 67% of our referrals were through the court system, okay? But that means someone who was arrested, all right? So think about it again, someone who's experienced exploitation and victimization, the criminal justice system is totally failing them because they're arresting women and then they're going through the court system, okay? But they were being diverted and saying, hey, we want to view this case as someone being a victim versus a criminal. But that ultimately for us ideologically, like we want to be connected to that space if someone's interacting with the victim, but we need to shift where those referrals are coming from. So we went from saying all of these court referrals to moving in the direction of we want our primary referral base ultimately being from the community. So now the court referrals only make up about 22% of our funds, under a quarter, right? And that's been specific because we want to be able to have an intervention or a connection before someone experiences an arrest or even multiple arrests, okay? And so now our referral sources are really diversified, and not only in New York City, but just this past year we received referrals from 22 different states. And so a lot of my work is actually consulting and working with other programs out of state.
Just to follow up on that question,
Yeah.
right? Is that because like the experience with these institutions makes it that much harder to create sort of relationships in community, I mean, with these victims as they, receive whatever they're receiving from you? Because you guys are pretty big, you're organized, it's very institutional.
Yeah.
But how does that play into that? Like,
You mean the
you guys, wanting to go more community based instead of court based.
Oh yes, yeah. So that it really was an ideological thing of. You think about this, like even if it's not talking about trafficking, even if you're running a business and thinking about customers, you're trying to expand your reach, right? We wanted to be more community based. Not saying the courts aren't, completely not, but the intervention was dependent on law enforcement, okay, and it was dependent on an arrest, okay. So if anybody's ever experienced an arrest, right, or has a friend that's been arrested, not a good situation, right, regardless of the crime, okay. So knowing that, we were advocating of moving away from that as a city, saying don't take away the court, but let's think about it from a different way. If the solution to trafficking and people are hearing about it, the cops are just going to do what cops do. And we have a lot of friends that are cops, so I'm not trying to use derogatory language towards cops, but they would just have an order. Okay, we need to do a sweep. This is what they call them. So they'll just go to Flushing, they'll go to 41st, they'll go there and just sweep these parlors, and then you're having 80 women go through the courts. Think about that, right? The institution is basically starts to criminalize them, but then they get connected to an agency. So that point of intervention needs to be higher up the chain, not after all of these things. Do we have successful cases that came through the courts? Absolutely. I have coworkers, right? So we have a little less than a third of our staff are survivors or graduates. Okay, game changer for our work is that we have survivors who are now involved in the restoration of other people. Do we have a ton of those cases that came through the courts originally? Yes. We're not saying it's a 100% bad thing, but if we're going to diversify, we want to move more towards being on the ground, post-arrest, outside of that criminal justice system. So we need to be creative. How do we do that?
Question.
Yeah.
I guess what's the best thing an individual can do? If we know that there's 4 massage parlors done black, what do we do in that instance then?
Yeah.
If we're just regular people and we're not necessarily part of an institution, or
Sure.
we don't want to call the cops or anything.
Yeah.
So, and we're inexperienced, so.
Sure. Yeah, my answer to that, what can you do in those situations? I would say again, this I feel like is the least satisfactory answer, right? If I'm just gonna be honest. What I would say is don't rush to judgment, right? That parlor could be totally okay, right? But also don't rush to do something. For us, it's more about if you've witnessed something that looks problematic, then often you either want to call the hotline, because the national hotline will keep a database of all of these things. So if something does come up, there's evidence that something was already reported, right? That would be our first thing. If you see something or you have contact with the women, I would say just befriend them, neighbor them, right? Without judging or without trying to like assume their exploitation. The other thing is like how can you connect them to community, right? Community is often the game changer when it comes to disclosure, versus get someone to disclose and then connect them to community, right? Think about even relationally, right? How safe we feel once we feel like we know. Like when we step into this room, like when I stepped into this home today, like I'm an outsider, right? For some of you, maybe you've been here today, like there's a feeling of, oh, I can maybe come to this space and maybe talk about that I'm not having a great week. In the same way, that seems much more long-term and much more gray, but if you at all can connect someone to community, would be huge. The last thing I would say is like, if you see something violent happening, that would be when you would want to call the police. I would have that be the last resort. There's other folks who are doing kind of outreach ministry. We have a little bit different perspective on that, like, and just the questions of outcomes, like how successful is it for the resources and time we're putting into it. And I think really that model is based off of a different model that worked in strip clubs. So what's happening right now is that people are approaching massage parlors like other groups approach strip clubs, okay? And what we do, we tend to do this, whatever industry we are, is we take something else and say, hey, that worked here, and we just apply it, right? Okay, but if you think about who's working often in massage parlors, whether they're being exploited or not, are those the same, is that the same demographic or group of people that we see working at a strip club, right? I'm just saying, probably not, right? Thinking about language, thinking about citizenship, thinking about life experience. And again, their exploitation is going to look different depending on that industry. So if we're applying that outreach, often it can seem a little bit daunting for someone who's a survivor who's working in that space. Right? The one thing I would say is like if you can connect with an anti-trafficking organization, like I think is one of the best ways to not just know more about the problem, but then also being a resource when things do come up. Yeah, and I understand it's a very unsatisfactory answer. Right? It's like, here's this big problem. I know it's complicated, but that's where anytime we can build a